Hello my lovelies, hello my darlings. So welcome back for another episode of Total Liberation. This is chapter 1, the 21st century context, and we start off with From Class Struggle to Identity Politics. It's not that we've forgotten the meaning of revolution, on the contrary, it's the refusal to let go of that old meaning that's holding us back. With every passing moment, the state of the world changes irreversibly. Perspectives that once commanded utmost dedication begin to stagnate, losing touch with the tides of a reality that swirls in a constant motion. Even the brightest ideas are bound to accumulate dust, and so too those offered in response. To this day, most dreams of revolution come grounded in some variant of Marxian analysis. On this account, class is the central principle, both for understanding oppression as well as resisting it. History is taken to consist primarily in the drama of class struggle. Different historical phases, meanwhile, are defined by the mode of production that sets the stage. The current phase is capitalism, in which the means of production, factories, natural resources and so on are owned by the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and worked for wages by the working class, the proletariat. Almost everyone in capitalist society is split fundamentally between one of those two molar heaps: bosses or workers, exploiters or exploited. Whilst the basic solution, as Marxists and anarcho-syndicalists traditionally see it, is the application of workplace organisation towards the revolutionary destruction of class-divided society. In concrete terms, that means the proletariat rising up and seizing the means of production, replacing capitalism with the final phase of history, communism, a classless, stateless, moneyless society. Having risen to predominance in the West around the end of the 19th century, this current of revolutionary struggle approached its climax towards the beginning of the 20th. At this point, the mutinies that closed down the First World War avalanched into a wave of proletarian uprisings that shook Europe to its core. Beginning with the Russian Revolution in 1917, the reverberations soon catalyzed major insurrections in Germany, Hungary and Italy. 2 decades later, this unmatched period of heightened class struggle culminated in the 1936 Spanish Revolution, arguably the single greatest feat of workers' self-organisation in history. Centred in Catalonia, millions of workers and peasants put the means of production under directly democratic control, especially in Barcelona, amongst the most industrially developed cities in the world. Yet the glory days of the revolutionary proletariat were in many ways also its last stand. In Italy and Germany, the fascist regimes of Mussolini and Hitler already reigned supreme. In the Soviet Union, meanwhile, the initial promise of the Russian Revolution had long since degenerated into Bolshevism, diverting most of the energy associated with socialism towards authoritarian ends. Apparently, both fascism and Bolshevism succeeded in annihilating the possibility of workers' control all the more effectively by simultaneously valorizing it. Never again would organised labour come close to regaining its former revolutionary potential. What followed was a period of relative slumber amongst the social movements of the West. This was eventually undone by a wave of social struggles that broke out during the 1960s, which in many places put the prospect of revolution back on the table. But something about this new era of revolt was markedly different. Besides its various labour movements, here we see the likes of second-wave feminism, black nationalism and queer struggle begin to occupy the foreground. No longer was class struggle regarded as one and the same with the overall project of human liberation, and that began to to profoundly undermine the neat old picture you get with Marxian class analysis. Maybe there's no primary division splitting society anymore, no single fault line upon which to base the totality of our resistance. The situation has instead been revealed as much messier, exceeding the exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, if not capitalism altogether. That said, something vital you still get with Marxian analysis, even centuries after it was first formulated, is its timeless emphasis on the material features of oppression. After all, it's not as if the classical concerns of revolutionaries, in particular the state and the capital, have since just melted away. One of the biggest problems with many contemporary social struggles is their readiness to turn a blind eye to these structures, forgetting the key insight worth salvaging from Marx. Genuine liberation is impossible without securing the material conditions of autonomy. On the other hand, though, classical revolutionaries tend to emphasize these concerns only at the expense of neglecting those which are, in a sense, more psychological, defined by matters of identity rather than one's relationship to property. There's something reassuring in that, given that treating class as a primary allows you to take the entirety of problems we face, social, political, economic, ecological, and condense them into one. But such an approach has little chance of reflecting the complexity of power in the 21st century, with all divisions aside from class soon being neglected. To note, there are conceivable responses here. Some have made a point of extending Marxian analysis beyond an exclusive focus on class. Of the arguments offered, perhaps the most influential contends that structures such as white supremacy and patriarchy, homophobia and transphobia are strengthened by the ruling class in order to divide and rule the working class. Therefore, any prudent take on class struggle must take care to simultaneously oppose them all, or else fail to build the unity necessary for overthrowing capitalism. Such is exactly the kind of discourse used to give the impression that Marxian analysis is equally concerned with all oppressions. Granted, this approach is more sophisticated than claiming any deviations from the class line are mere distractions, as some do even today, but still you shouldn't be convinced too easily. Lurking beneath the sloganeering here is the basic assumption that even if class isn't the only form of oppression, it remains the central one, underpinning the relevance of all the rest. Other oppressions are important to oppose, yet hardly on their own terms. Their importance remains secondary, pragmatic, warranting recognition only insofar as they serve as a means within the broader class struggle. This shortcoming has long since been a call for new forms of struggle to emerge, ones which recognise that class isn't the only oppression worthy of intrinsic concern. The fading of the old left, along with its fixation with Marxism and class struggle, soon gave rise to a new left in Europe and America. Amongst other factors, this transition has been defined by the growing predominance of identity politics over class struggle. Identity politics follows from the presumed usefulness of coming together around various shared identities, say being black, a woman, gay, transgender or disabled, as a means for understanding and resisting oppression. This eagerness to treat all liberation struggles as ends in themselves did away with the primacy of class. Rather, efforts were split more evenly between different minority groups, adding depth to previously neglected concerns. At first, this trend offered a fair degree of revolutionary potential. The Black Panther Party, for example, recognised that black power was inseparable from achieving community autonomy in fully tangible ways, as was manifest in a range of activity that included everything from armed self-defence to food distribution, drug rehabilitation and elderly care. Also in the US, the Combahee River Collective, who introduced the modern usage of the term identity politics in 1977, saw their own liberation as queer black women merely as a single component of a much larger struggle against all oppressions, class included. Even Martin Luther King, currently a favourite amongst pacifist reformers, emphasised not long before his death that anti-racism was meaningless when separated from a broader opposition to capitalism. As time passed, however, identity politics drifted irretrievably from its antagonistic origins, eventually coming to be associated with the separation of issues of identity from class struggle altogether. Broadly insensitive to the material features of liberation, the term nowadays suggests political engagement that's heavily focused around moralistic displays and the policing of language, something that, quite inadvertently, can easily end up excluding the rest of the population, especially those lacking an academic grounding. Any larger political strategies, meanwhile, are typically focused not on dissolving the institutions of politics, business and law enforcement, but instead on making them more accommodating to marginalised groups, thereby conceding the overall legitimacy of class-divided society. It's no coincidence that this reformist, essentially liberal approach to social transformation only took off in tandem with that unspoken assumption, cemented since the 1980s, regarding our chances of a revolution actually happening anymore. In short, identity politics has been contained within a fundamental position of compromise with power, taking it for granted the state and capital are here to stay. Perhaps the central problem with identity politics today is that having had the good sense to abandon Marxian analysis, it loses the ability to account for what's common to the plethora of social problems we face. If oppressive relations cannot be reduced to class, then what's the underlying structure that binds them all together? The only alternative is to treat different oppressions as disconnected and remote, problems that can, in their various forms, be overcome without challenging the system as a whole. Identity politics thus lacks the conceptual bridge needed to draw different social movements into a holistic, revolutionary struggle. Particularly in its most vulgar forms, liberation struggles are treated as isolated or even competitive concerns, inviting the reproduction of oppressive relations amongst those supposed to be fighting them. Having said that, an explicit response to these limitations was offered by intersectionality, which began gaining traction in the 1980s. The point of this theory is to demonstrate how different axes of domination overlap, compounding the disadvantages received by those exposed to more than one oppressive identity. By focusing only on gender, for example, feminist movements tend to prioritise the experience of their most privileged participants, typically white, wealthy women. In order to undermine patriarchy effectively, therefore, feminism must embrace a much larger spectrum of concern, inviting the narratives of marginalised women to the forefront. A key virtue of intersectionality has thus been its emphasis on the interconnected nature of power, predicting the effectiveness of different liberation struggles on their ability to support one another. Unlike with Marxian class analysis, moreover, it does so without positing that any single axis of domination is somehow primary, which offers a vital contribution for going forward. Despite its utility for revolutionaries, however, intersectionality has generally failed to avoid co-optation by neoliberal capitalism. Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, with its numerous references to the likes of the combined effects of intersecting issues that impact communities of colour, is but one example. Or else look at its seamless application by the mega corporations nowadays, to the extent that Sony Pictures even has its own director of intersectional marketing, a role designed to ensure that marketing campaigns achieve maximum outreach to targeted multicultural and LGBT plus demographics. How has a seemingly radical theory been diverted towards blatant reactionary ends? A first problem with intersectionality, as with identity politics more generally, is its abandonment of classical revolutionary concerns. At best, class is discussed merely in terms of classism, namely an individual prejudice that can be undone simply by changing opinions, rather than abolishing class-divided society overall. Meanwhile, the state, a concrete institution, not an identity category such as race, gender or class, is typically ignored altogether, inevitably resulting in toothless political programs. Moreover, this distinct lack of material analysis lends to a second problem, apparently the inherent defect of any take on identity politics, the inability to locate a common thread to the constitution of oppression as such. By setting out ever more subcategories of oppressed identities, not just being a black woman, for instance, but also a black trans woman, a black disabled trans woman, and so on, the consequence is an endless process of compartmentalization. This emphasis on complexity could easily be a source of strength, opening up multiple fronts of diffuse engagement, inviting greater numbers to participate without having to assume a secondary role. Yet by focusing only on particularities, any notion of a common enemy against which to generalize revolt soon vanishes. Only when combined with a broader, concretely revolutionary vocabulary can intersectionality be used to promote diversity rather than fragmentation, undermining power as a totality. Of course, none of the failures of identity politics should detract from the gains hard won over the years, even if transphobia continues to lag behind. Overt racism, sexism, and homophobia are rarely tolerated by mainstream politics in much of the global north, something unthinkable just a few decades ago. The uncomfortable fact, however, is that capitalism has been quite happy to adapt to these changes, taking on this or that superficial tarnish, yet remaining wholly the same in terms of its core operations. Women have flowed into the workplace just as the nuclear family continues to disintegrate. Nonetheless, human existence remains dominated by wage labour, property relations, and value accumulation. Amidst all the profound historical shifts, the misery of employment remains constant. Workers in Amazon's warehouses, as contemporary a workplace as you could imagine, are subject to intense surveillance and control, with many too fearful of their productivity quotas to even use the bathroom. No joke, only recently various companies have begun microchipping their workers to keep track of them better. The opportunity to vote for a black or female head of state or for queers to marry or join the military poses little threat to the operation of business as usual. If anything, it only strengthens the liberal paradigm, allowing people to convince themselves, despite the gap between the rich and the poor growing consistently worldwide, as well as each new day dragging us closer to the brink of ecological meltdown, that somehow things are actually getting better. Decades of alleged ideological progress only to be met with the turning of a circle. The basic features of authoritarian society, at least as strong as they were a century ago. Such is the impasse we're faced with. Taken by itself, class struggle fails to account for the complexity of oppression, attempting to subsume each of its forms into the monolithic category of economic exploitation. Identity politics, on the other hand, breaks out of this formula, yet only by abandoning any semblance of a revolutionary perspective. Rather than collaborating to produce a tangible threat to the existent, therefore, all that class struggle and identity politics did was swap their problems. Both trends offer their own vital insights, but neither charts the possibilities of new worlds altogether. Not even close. The prism of social hierarchy. Amidst these broad historical shifts, the last decades of struggle have also seen a critique of social hierarchy becoming increasingly influential, particularly within anarchist circles. Writers like Murray Bookchin described hierarchies as including any social relation that allows one individual or group to wield power over another. In his words, by hierarchy, I mean the cultural, traditional, and psychological systems of obedience and command, not merely the economic and political systems to which the terms class and state most appropriately refer. Accordingly, hierarchy and domination could easily continue to exist in a classless or stateless society. Now that's from The Ecology of Freedom, 1982. What Bookchin offers here is a lens for understanding society that explicitly exceeds Marxist and anarchist orthodoxies, especially the class reductionism. This isn't a matter of doing away with the struggle against the state and capital, given that both institutions are as hierarchical as any. Rather, the point is to recognise that additional hierarchies, those based, for example, on relations of race, gender, sexuality, age, ability, and species, cannot be entirely contained within the narrow categories either of economic exploitation or political coercion. Various hierarchies existed before the advent of both class and the state, be it the hierarchy of men over women, the old over the young, or humans over other animals. And they will continue to exist in the future too, even within ostensibly radical circles, unless we make a concerted effort to undermine them in the now. What we need is a broader focus for our resistance, one that includes a deep concern for the old targets without being limited by them. A social critique based on hierarchy offers this distinctly horizontal outlook, combining an appreciation of the holism of domination with the refusal to single out any one of its axes as primary. This is no call to do away with class analysis altogether. The broad, materially focused analysis of theorists like Marx remain useful for explaining how economic factors motivated much of the development of oppressive relations. Nor can we forget that, were it not for the invention of the state, the normalisation of these relations to such a staggering extent would have been impossible. But we need to appreciate these insights without going overboard, mistakenly taking either class or the state to be the crux of the social domination. Treating any single form of oppression as primary, almost always the one we just happen to feel closest to, is all too often a cheap excuse for sidelining the others. And this problem isn't somehow abstract or peripheral either, but denotes one of the main reasons many resistance movements seem incapable of relating to broader sections of society nowadays. Only by granting equal consideration to all oppressions can the struggle begin to maximise its inclusivity, accommodating those people, in fact the vast majority of people, whose experiences and well-being have already been marginalised everywhere else. Unlike identity politics, however, what keeps the critique of hierarchy from trailing off into reformism is that it nonetheless locates all oppressions within a single power structure. Only this time it's hierarchy, not class, that frames the discussion as such. You can explain patriarchy, for example, not only as a specific form of oppression, but also as something that arises from a set of relations that includes gender, whilst vastly exceeding it. Because there's something inherent in patriarchy that permeates all other instances of oppression, and that thing is its core structure. Specifically, its hierarchical structure. Patriarchy can be summarized simply as gender hierarchy. White supremacy, meanwhile, is a specific kind of racial hierarchy. The state, is the hierarchy of government over society, and capitalism, the hierarchy of the ruling class over the working class, and so on. It's impossible to imagine an instance of oppression that isn't grounded in exactly this kind of setup, namely an institution that grants one section of society arbitrary control over another. Which is to say that all oppressions, no matter how diverse, presuppose the very same asymmetrical power relations, each of them subordinating the needs of one group to the whims of another. Everything from homelessness to pollution to transgender suicides can thus be revealed not as isolated issues, but instead as flowing from a common source. What we're dealing with, basically, is a single problem. Social hierarchy is a hydra with many heads, but only one body. Some might approach this description with caution, as if it were just another attempt to reduce all oppressions to one. But the critique of hierarchy isn't reductionist. In the Marxian sense, rather than singling out any one form of oppression as more fundamental than the others, it merely emphasizes the structure they all assume. This kind of bigger picture thinking hardly means failing to realize what's unique to every liberation struggle, as if to subsume them into some amorphous whole. The point is only to emphasize particularities without getting bogged down in them. That means combining an intimate knowledge of different oppressions with a broader understanding of those features they all hold in common, including the very real pain, exclusion, and destruction of potential each entails. In other words, every form of oppression, aside from being a problem in itself, must also serve as a gateway for entering the clash with social hierarchy as a whole. It can be easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer breadth of issues we're facing. That is, if we're going to approach them one by one. But this isn't the only option open to us. Framing the discussion in terms of hierarchy, already common sense for many, offers that broad revolutionary perspective we've lost sight of, locating all oppressions within a single power structure. Yet it does so in a way that refuses to prioritise any particular aspect of that structure, thereby balancing the key virtues of class struggle and identity politics. Revolutionary struggle in the 21st century calls out to a new horizon. It's time to strive beyond mere economic destinations such as socialism or communism. Just as the absence of formal political institutions like the state will never be enough, rather what matters here is bringing about anarchy, the absence of mastery of any kind, in the fullest sense of the word. The anarchist project must thereby be distinguished from the antiquated goals of Marxists, as well as the left more generally. The point is to dismantle oppression in all possible forms, and it means taking the maxim seriously too, instead of cashing it out as just another empty slogan. Be wary, comrades, who knows what adventures could result from such an audacious proposal. So, that was chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed listening to that. Join me next time for chapter 2, The Greening of Revolution, which will cover animal liberation and earth liberation. Thanks for watching, my lovelies. Thanks for watching, my darlings. Love and light, or maybe I should say, more appropriately, love and rage.